pray these slides come up now. Let's see. Okay, we need to go back. There we go. So I'm going to be talking about the subject of my book, Torn Apart, on abolishing family policing and reimagining child welfare. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the term abolish, although we all know that there was a movement to abolish slavery. We're all grateful for that. And so let's not think about it as a scary word, and I'm going to explain what I mean by abolishing family policing. So I'm going to start by talking about 3 cases that were in the news recently, which you may have heard about. Let me see if I can take this out. There we go. And one involved a couple and their newborn baby driving on a highway in Florida, and the Manatee County Sheriff's Department pulled the car over and demanded that they turn over their newborn daughter. And the reason the sheriffs did this was because they had a judge's order called a pickup order. Thank you. A pickup order to seize their baby. Now, how did they get into this situation? Well, when Saisha Mercado, you may recognize her name, she was a finalist in American Idol. When she was pregnant with this baby and taking care of her toddler son, who she was transferring from breastfeeding to solid food, she was having some difficulty. She was afraid that her son was not getting enough nutrition. He may be dehydrated, so she brought him to a hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida. And of course, you would think that the hospital staff then, noticing her concern for this baby, her toddler, would have just given her some help, but instead they called the child abuse hotline on her. And they said that the baby, again, the toddler was failing to thrive. This was a case of medical neglect, and so they kept her child at the hospital. She lost custody, and the child was put in foster care. So now she has this new baby, but she's in the child welfare system. She's been deemed a neglectful mother. And so a judge ordered that this newborn baby had to be put into state custody as well. And that's why the sheriffs came, surrounded the car. And I don't know if you've seen this video, which her partner, Tyrone Denier, live streamed, but it is heartbreaking. She is crying. You can see the image up here to the right of her handing the baby over to the caseworkers who are standing there. And she's saying, "Please don't take my baby. My baby is healthy. There's nothing wrong with my baby. What are you going to feed my baby? My baby's breastfeeding." They didn't care. They took the baby. Now, I think partly because of her notoriety as a finalist on American Idol, because she had a team of lawyers, and because of the public attention to the case, the family was able to get the baby back after 10 days, but 10 days of a newborn nursing baby for no reason. There was nothing wrong with this child in the foster care system. You can only imagine the harm that that caused, and I cannot imagine any good that it did for that baby or their family. A couple more recent cases I'll tell you about quickly. You may have heard as well. The Clybourne and Williams family in Tennessee in February. They were driving from Georgia to Chicago to attend a funeral. And the police in Tennessee pulled the car over on grounds that the windows were tinted too dark and some other minor violations. They found a small amount of marijuana in the car, and they arrested the father. And then at court, when the mother came with the family, the children, they have 5 children, to attend the hearing, Child Protection came in and took all the children and put them in foster care. They also spoke out, and the judge reprimanded the mother for speaking out about this injustice to their family, but they eventually got their children back. Again, I think so quickly because of the public attention that was paid to it. And then more recently in Dallas, the Jackson family. They had a baby at home, attended to by a midwife, and when they brought her to the pediatrician, their regular pediatrician, for a checkup, the pediatrician diagnosed the baby with jaundice, a common condition for newborns, and wanted them to bring the baby to the hospital to be treated. Now they decided they wanted the midwife to care for their newborn. Doctor disagreed. He called Child Protective Services. Police came to the home, arrested the father, and took the baby into state custody, placed in foster care. Again, you have to ask, is this doing more harm or good? Is this child protection in these cases? Or is it more harm on these children? Now, I use these three cases not because they're rare aberrational cases, but because in fact they reflect some common features of our child welfare system in America. Number one, they targeted black families. And I'll say a little bit more about how black families are, I say, targeted by this system. Number two, they were all on grounds of child neglect. There was no evidence that these children were being abused, that these were uncaring parents even. It was all on allegations that the parents neglected the children. And in fact, in the United States, and I'm sure this is true in Wisconsin and Milwaukee, the vast majority of investigations and child removals, family separations, are based on neglect, which means failure to meet some need of children. And in almost all those cases, it's very hard to disentangle neglect either from poverty, simply the parents can't afford to meet all the needs, lack of housing, clothing, nutrition, health care, or because of stereotypical views of what children need, and then the views that the parents haven't met those needs. But they're not based on what most people think that child removal is caused by. They're not based on physical or sexual abuse. In the United States, only about 16 or 17% of children in foster care are there on allegations of physical or sexual abuse. Again, the vast majority is on allegations of child neglect. And then the third thing that these cases show is the deep entanglement of the criminal legal system and the civil child welfare system. They all involve police officers enforcing the removal of children from their families. And I'll say some more about how the criminal legal system and police officers are really inextricably entangled with the way in which the child welfare system operates in the United States. So I want to say a little bit about my journey getting to the conclusion I've reached that we need a radically different way of approaching keeping children safe and improving children's welfare in America. And I first learned about the child welfare system when I was working on a book, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. And that book is about the longstanding regulation and devaluation in America of black women's childbearing. And what brought me to write that book was I noticed, take yourselves back to the late 1980s, some of you were around then, some of you May not have been, but I was. Take yourselves back to the late 1980s, and you may recall there was a war on crack cocaine in black neighborhoods. And it was like no other aspect of the drug war. More intense police involvement, more arrests, harsher penalties for using or possessing crack or distributing crack cocaine than any other drug. And part of that war was against black mothers. There was a problem of drug use during pregnancy, not just in black communities. It's an issue that affects all communities, actually, but that had never been treated as a crime. All of a sudden, prosecutors began to arrest black mothers for being pregnant and using drugs. And this myth of the so-called crack baby was developed, that black children exposed to crack cocaine had medical problems and social problems that no other babies had. And you know very well, if you heard that image, the crack baby, it's a black baby. It's a black baby. And they were predicted to have irreparable damage. They weren't going to be able to learn. They were going to be welfare cheats, and they were going to be criminals. And there were all these scary news stories about them. And then developed this policy that the way to protect these babies was to arrest their mothers, put them in jail while they were pregnant, or after they had the baby, if the baby tested positive, to charge the mothers with crimes. And they were charged with all sorts of crimes: child abuse, distributing drugs to a minor on the grounds that they were distributing the drugs through the umbilical cord before it was cut, attempted murder. Hundreds of black women around the country were being arrested. And I looked at that and said, well, why is it just a crime when black women are pregnant and using drugs? And I connected it to the history of punishing black mothers for having children. That was a piece of my book, but I expanded it into the whole history of the oppression of black mothers and negative stereotypes about black mothers. So as I was doing that research and began to talk with some of these women, I realized that to them, the biggest punishment they were experiencing was that their babies were being taken from them. In fact, there was a term, border babies, because so many babies were being taken from black mothers and boarded at hospitals. There's nowhere to put them. And then, of course, these babies were failing to thrive. They're being warehoused in hospitals, and then the mothers were blamed for the problems that they had. Now, by the way, research has been done since that myth of the crack baby that shows that there's no such thing as a crack baby. These babies did have health problems, but that was because of the conditions in which their mothers were forced to be during pregnancy, which were conditions of everybody in the neighborhood, whether you use drugs or not. It's poverty. It's lack of good nutrition, lack of good prenatal care. All of that was the harm, but the mothers were being blamed for it. Well, then I started looking into what is this system that's taking thousands and thousands of newborn babies from their mothers and acting as if that's good for the babies. And that's when I discovered the child welfare system. And at that time, this is now the late 1990s, I discovered that black children were the largest group of children in the foster care system in America. The largest group, almost half of children in foster care in America, more than 40% in 1998, were black children. Black children are 13, 14% of the US child population. What did that mean? They were 4 times as likely as white children to be taken from their families. I couldn't believe this. I'm like, why isn't this number one in our civil rights agenda? Why isn't this something that every civil rights activist is talking about? We're talking about taking children from their families en masse. En masse. And there was nothing being said about it. Nothing at the policy level. No books being written about it. The book before then, the only book that was available was a book written in the 1970s, Children of the Storm. And so I said, I have to write a book about this. This is so obviously a racist system. I'm just going to be plain. I was living in Chicago at the time, teaching at Northwestern University, and I started to sit in on dependency court hearings. And I kid you not, all I saw were black families in the court pleading to get their children back. I never saw a family that wasn't black. And that's reflected by the statistics in Chicago at the time. More than 90% of the families of children in foster care in Chicago at the time were black. And I don't think it's changed very much since then. So I wrote a book that Jermaine Reed mentioned, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, where I just laid out the statistics, these startling statistics about the high rates of child removal in black communities. And I argued that this is a racial justice issue. We should be concerned, we should be alarmed, we should be doing something about this. Cannot be the best way to address the needs of black families by taking their children away. And the main service, so-called service, provided to black families by our child welfare system, where most of the money is spent, is on taking children away and maintaining them away from their families. 10 times more money, even today, is spent on maintaining children away from their families than on providing services to intact families. And all of that happened because black families became on the radar of the child welfare system. Before black families were involved, when we were excluded from the system, most of the money went to services to children in their homes. When this was a white system, money went to children in their homes. As more and more black families began to enter the system in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you see this skyrocketing of the foster care population, all on the removal of black children from their homes and a shift in policy to be more punitive, to accuse families, to investigate, to separate. So I then, after publishing Shattered Bonds in 2001, I began to get involved in reforming the child welfare system. I wrote reports for foundations on what now was beginning to get the attention of researchers and policymakers and administrators, what was called racial disproportionality in the child welfare system. People, although it was obvious, began to acknowledge that black children were at far higher risk of being taken from their homes, and that there was an overrepresentation of black children in the child welfare system, and they were much more likely than white children to be taken, or other children, other than Native children. Native children, Native American children, are also at very high risk. And so I began to write reports. I gave lots of talks. I helped to train social workers. And I even spent 9 years as a national expert on child welfare in Washington State as a result of a class action lawsuit where a group of children's attorneys filed a federal action alleging that the child welfare system was violating the constitutional rights of children in Washington State. And the state and the children's attorneys settled, And part of the settlement was to create a panel of 5 national experts who were going to create a plan for Washington State to reform its system so it stopped violating the rights of children. Children in Washington State, like children in foster care everywhere, were not getting the services they were supposed to be getting. They were not being enrolled in school on time. They were not getting the medical care they were supposed to be getting. Children with special needs were not getting the special services they were supposed to be getting. And there were children running away from foster care and living in the streets of Seattle and Tacoma and other cities in Washington State. And the state said they didn't know what to do. So we were supposed to tell them how to fix their system. We spent 7 years doing that. We created a big implementation plan, benchmarks, steps toward it. We met every month with, in Olympia or at a hotel in Seattle, and we went down, met with the head of the child welfare system, the attorney, someone from the Attorney General's office, and went through step by step. What have you accomplished? So after 7 years, we said, well, we need 2 more years because we haven't accomplished enough. So we spent 2 more years. After 9 years, I made so many trips across country to Seattle. That hotel at the Seattle airport, I knew inside and out. And we just basically gave up. It was like, we can't continue this. We may have made some progress, but fundamentally, the system was the same. It was still based on accusing parents who most of them did not have all the means they needed to meet their children's needs, accusing them of child neglect, investigating their families, giving them a long list of tasks they had to perform, many of which had nothing to do with the problems of the family. The idea that let's just train the parents better in how to be good parents, and maybe they'll be able to find housing. But train them better, maybe they'll be able to find medical care. Maybe they'll be able to meet the needs of their children with mental health problems if we train them better. Not providing the resources they needed, but providing some kind of therapy, because the idea is something's wrong with these parents. They're unfit, and that's what their problems are. But that doesn't work. And as long as that continued to be the foundation of how the system operated, this is why I call it a family policing system, because its purpose is to police families, to investigate them, accuse them, and supervise them. It does not necessarily, as I showed in those 3 opening stories, keep children safe or improve their welfare, because the system doesn't provide what families really need to improve their welfare. It provides means of supervising the families. But if you don't radically change the reasons why families don't have what they need to meet their needs in America, you're not going to make the changes. Our committee task force couldn't do it because we weren't assigned the task of really getting to the root causes of the unmet needs of children in Washington State. Let's see if I can get to the, can I get a little help with this? My next slide. You all look beautiful, but I'm trying to get trying to get my slide. Aha, okay. So before, thank you. Let's see, okay. I ended up 20 years later Some people suggested, well, you should write a new preface for Shattered Bonds and do some updates on the statistics. And I said, you know what? I want to write a different book. I want to write a book that tells the truth, plain and simple, about how the system operates, that doesn't hold back, and that says we just need to dismantle it piece by piece. This isn't something that's going to happen quickly. This is a almost $40 billion industry in America. So it's not going to happen quickly. But we can do the kinds of reforms that actually lead to radically changing our approach to how we care for children and keep them safe. And we're not doing that now, let's be honest. We're not doing that now. So I mentioned before that those cases at the beginning were not aberrational, and one of their key features was that they targeted black families. And I said I would explain why I say targeted black families. The numbers of black children who are under investigation, removed from their homes, or parental rights terminated, where they completely lose their legal rights to their family, are so high in black communities that I think we have to acknowledge that these families are targeted by the system. You know, there are communities in America, and I would say every predominantly black neighborhood in America, especially if it's below the poverty line, which most segregated black communities are, impoverished communities. Everybody, every child, every mother, every father in that community knows that they are under the watch of the child welfare system, because the numbers are so high of children who've been investigated or children removed from their homes that even if you haven't been, your cousin has, or your best friend has, or your classmate or classmates have. Every school in these communities have children in foster care. Every family has somebody, some relative, who's been in foster care or whose child has been placed in foster care. So you know that this system is out there. And I have done research on this. I've read lots of studies on this. And most people see it as an intrusion into their neighborhood. They're not calling on it for help. They're afraid to. They're afraid to call for help because they're afraid their children are going to be taken from them. And so this is a racial impact. There is no black neighborhood, there's no white neighborhood in America, other than maybe some pockets of rural poverty where you have that kind of intense involvement of child protective services. So it's not just the statistics of black children are twice as likely to be taken from their homes. You know, black children make up twice the percentage in foster care as their representation in the general population. It's the experience of living in a community where there's so much child welfare agency involvement. And that has barely been looked at. It's dramatically different for black children in America, their relationship to the government, because this is often the main government agency. When I did research on this in Chicago, everybody called it the system. They didn't call the prison system the system. They didn't call the welfare system the system. It was the child welfare system. DCFS was the system because it was the most present government agency in their lives. And I'll tell you, I was interviewing black mothers in Woodlawn in Chicago, and none of them wanted to say that their children had been put in foster care. So these were people who claimed they didn't have children in foster care, but they still saw it as an agency that came in to take children and put them in foster care. So just some recent studies that have been looking at not only how many black children are in foster care today, but what is the risk for a black child in America today that they will be put in foster care by the time they reach age 18? That's what we really want to know. What are the chances that black children will experience foster care, being taken from their homes and put in the custody of the state, sometimes with relatives, but still most children in America are placed with strangers or in congregate care? What are their chances of that? And 11% of black children will experience family separation, placement in foster care by the time they reach age 18, as slightly higher for Native American children in America. Then, recent study looked at, well, what are the chances that a black child will experience a child welfare investigation? Now, some people will say, well, what's the big deal if you're investigated? Well, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And I know many people in this room know that, because either they've conducted investigations or they've experienced investigations or they know someone who has. It means government agents coming into your home, usually without following the Fourth Amendment and getting a warrant, because people are scared, or they may bring police officers with them, and they can search every corner of your house. They can interrogate everybody in your family, including children. They can strip search children, and they do, to look for evidence of abuse. They can collect all manner of private information about you. Medical records, school records, criminal legal system records. I don't know how they do it in Milwaukee, but in some places they have a blank form, sign it, parent. And the blank, then they fill in all the information that you've just agreed to give them without having a list of what that information is. They can talk to neighbors, they can talk to teachers. They could collect whatever they want, not only based on the allegations that maybe came in at an anonymous tip, but whatever else they might find in your home to investigate. So this is broad investigative power. It's more than what police officers can do. It's broad. And it's frightening, because you know it the whole time that if they find something that substantiates the allegation, they can right then and there take your children. Now, most investigations are not substantiated. The allegations are not substantiated. So nothing comes of it. But one way of looking at it is, if this family really had some need and there's no substantiation of the allegation of abuse, they're still left with the need that they had. And in fact, most families in need in America aren't investigated. And so we have these unmet needs that are supposed to be met by the system. Most are not met at all. They're not even attempted to be met. All right, investigations. Do you know how many black children in America will be subjected to this intensive child welfare investigation by the time they reach age 18? More than half. 53% of black children in America will be subjected to a child welfare investigation before they reach age 18. Just think about that. What does that say about this system? I mean, either it says something really terrible about black families, that we need to be under state investigation. Half of our children must be investigated for child maltreatment, or it says something about the system. Take your pick. Which do you think it is? Is this an over-policing of black families? Or is there something, the stereotypes are all true. We're unfit, we're neglectful, we don't know how to supervise our children, we pass on a negative lifestyle to our children. Are those stereotypes true? Or are we being over-policed by government agents who have, in some ways, more power than the police? Because police officers are supposed to get a warrant. They're supposed to have probable cause. They're supposed to have some judicial supervision before they start intervening. You're supposed to know your rights. They're supposed to tell you, you have a right to remain silent. You have a right to an attorney. In most places, caseworkers do not do that. In New York, we're fighting to get legislation just to tell parents their rights. Just to tell parents their rights, their constitutional rights. So, one of the reasons I say that we need to dismantle this system and that it is designed to target black families for policing, for punishment, for family separation, is the history of the system. And I don't have time to go into the long history. I write about it in my book, Torn Apart. But let me just mention a few key aspects of the history of how the United States government has approached the welfare of black children in America. And to really understand that, we have to go all the way back to the institution of slavery. Because for most of the history of black people in America, black families were denied any autonomy over children. Black children were under the legal authority of the white enslaver. And that white enslaver could do whatever he wanted to black children. They, at the auction block, could be separated from their families, and often were. Mother could be sold to one purchaser, father to another. Every child could be split apart. And even when they went together, they were sold together, or they were born to a family on one farm or plantation, for any reason, to pay off a debt. You wanted a relative to inherit a child. You wanted to punish an enslaved person who you thought was not working hard enough or too rebellious. Any reason, children could be sold off away from their parents. Children were punished, beaten, sexually assaulted. Parents had no legal authority to stop it. So this is the origin of the idea about black families needing supervision in America. Now, in terms of the formal child welfare system, I like to say that for black families, it began after the Civil War, when white people wanted to re-enslave black people. You know, the South lost the war, slavery was abolished, but there was a big drive to re-enslave black people, to continue to exploit their labor and deny us any rights. And that went on, you know, until the Civil Rights Movement. But one of the ways of doing that, which you may have heard about, was to start incarcerating black people for anything, just being on the street without good enough reason. And then the convict leasing system, leasing out black people to coal mines and railroads and other industries that were building up the South to work without any rights whatsoever. I mean, young black people put in mines, they never saw the light of day again, and working them to death, because now these company owners had no interest in extending their lives. They just get another one when they worked anybody to death. But fewer people know about the apprenticeship system. And white former enslavers began to take advantage of a system of apprenticeship for children that was supposed to place children in other people's homes so they could learn a trade, they could be educated. But for black people, black children, it was to take black children away from their families and put them to work with former white enslavers, sometimes the very people who had enslaved them, put back to work. And as soon as the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment were passed, as soon as states began to emancipate black people, white people began to go into court and petition on grounds that black parents were neglectful and that their children needed to be put into apprenticeship. And by the tens of thousands, right after the Civil War was won, black children were put back into work for their former enslavers, by the tens of thousands. That, to me, is the beginning of the formal child welfare system for black people. A judge determining that a black parent is neglectful, taking the child away and putting them into somebody else's home. For Native people, during the same period, child removal became a weapon of war. The US military decided one way we can win these wars to dispossess Native people in America is to take their children from them. And this was a military strategy. They began to take children by force away from Native families and put them initially in military camps and then in so-called boarding schools. And this policy extended into the 1970s with formal collaborations with the child welfare system, the Child Welfare League of America, to judge Native parents as neglectful, take their children and put them into white orphanages or get them adopted into white families. This was a formal policy of the US government, and it was only ended with the Indian Child Welfare Act in the 1970s, although that has not worked to stop the mass separation of Native children from their families, and the US Supreme Court is poised, perhaps, to end that Indian Child Welfare Act. It has a case before it right now, brought by white families claiming that the Indian Child Welfare Act violates their right to adopt Native children. And you know the court we have now, so who knows? Even for white children, the formal child welfare system was created to take impoverished children away from their families and, in many cases, put them on so-called orphan trains, send them from the streets of New York and other cities, and ship them to the Midwest and the Southwest on farms to work for strangers. Okay, now I told Jermaine, I don't need an hour. I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to speed this up a little bit. But we have moved forward to the civil rights movement when finally, black people, based on decades of struggle, were able to get formally the rights that white people had in America. And that included the rights to welfare benefits, which had been given exclusively to white people who were impoverished or needed assistance to raise their children. But as soon as that happened, and as soon as we began to see gains like the Brown versus Board of Education decision holding that segregated education was unequal, we began to see the use of child removal against black families as a backlash to the civil rights movement. And so I just have some dates here of what happened with states in the South beginning to impose unsuitable home or suitable home requirements, so claiming that black homes were unsuitable so they could not get welfare, but then the rule that if you were denied welfare because you had an unsuitable home, your children should be taken from you, and we start to see the funding of foster care by the federal government in Title IV by Congress. And as I mentioned before, then the mushrooming of the foster care population in America, mostly because of removal of black children from their homes, a radical shift in policy targeted at disrupting black families. We also saw, and I already mentioned this at the beginning, the circulation of stereotypes about black mothers being dangerous to their children, a threat to their children, a threat to their communities, a threat to their nations, with stereotypes like the so-called welfare queen, the myth that black women were having babies just to get a welfare check and then spending all the money on themselves and not caring for their children. And this fueled both the restructuring of welfare, the idea that we needed to end welfare because black women were cheating taxpayers out of their money, but also the prosecutions of black mothers for being pregnant and using drugs, and the continual buildup of the foster care population, with black children being the largest group in foster care. There is lots and lots of documentation of racial bias in every aspect of child welfare decision making. In the reporting of child abuse and neglect, in who gets investigated, which children get removed, which parents' rights are terminated, how long children spend in foster care. All of that, black children are at higher risk, and there is evidence of racial bias by everybody. Studies that show bias by caseworkers, studies that show bias by judges, studies that show bias by reporters. And I'll just mention one area where there is airtight evidence of racial discrimination, and that is in doctors' reporting of child abuse and neglect. Whether we're talking about their suspicions when a child comes in with an injury, well documented, they're more likely to suspect it's child abuse when it's a black family bringing in the child for the exact same injuries, and drug use during pregnancy, well documented that black women are more likely to be tested and reported for drug use than other women in America. And mandated reporting, and maybe we'll be able to talk about this in our discussion section, but it sounds good. Don't you want people to report their suspicions of child abuse and neglect? But think about it. When you tell people to report suspicions, it is an invitation to discriminate, because people suspect, as I just mentioned, based on racist stereotypes. This is well known. And it is a way of bringing more and more black families into this system, and it doesn't prevent, if we ended mandated reporting, it wouldn't prevent anyone from reporting. It just means you don't feel that you're obligated to report a suspicion. What mandated reporting leads to is that all the people that are supposed to be trained to provide care and support for families, doctors, teachers, social service providers, they all become places where people are afraid to go for help because they're afraid that their children will be taken from them. Again, well documented that this is the impact of mandated reporting. I mentioned at the beginning the entanglement of the criminal legal system and the child welfare system in every aspect, including the joint training of police officers and caseworkers, and the use of police officers to enforce entry into homes and removal of children. Another aspect of policing, modern day policing, that child welfare agencies are mimicking is high-tech surveillance. You may know that some police departments have engaged in computerized predictive analytics, where they predict parts of cities where they think that crime is going to occur, and then they intensely surveil and monitor those areas, go into those areas. If they find crime, which they're more likely to find if they've gone into the area, then they say, this proves the prediction was accurate. And so more and more child welfare departments are taking on this kind of high-tech surveillance of families where they use computerized data to predict which families are going to neglect their children and then trigger an investigation. And what that means is that it is yet another way of building in bias into the reporting and investigating of families. And again, research shows that these kinds of high-tech ways of predicting crime or predicting abuse are filled with racial discrimination and also discrimination against impoverished families. And some of these predictions and the databases only have families who rely on government aid, and so wealthy families aren't even subject at all to these predictions. All right, I mentioned that. So another way in which police officers have even greater rights, I mentioned that, that caseworkers have even greater power than police officers. I mentioned already the way in which police officers at least know they're supposed to tell suspects of their rights and know they're supposed to get a warrant. This is rarely applied in the case of child welfare investigations. Another is the way in which, even where it is legal to smoke marijuana or use other drugs, and so you would not be arrested for a crime, you can have your children removed. And I'm not sure what the policy is in Milwaukee, but in many places, as happened to this mother in New York, children removed on grounds that you use drugs. And this is being challenged in many lawsuits, but one in New York brought by the Bronx Defenders, challenging both the racial discrimination that happens with these policies, but also challenging the assumption that because a parent used drugs, that makes them unfit. Another entanglement of the child welfare system and the criminal legal system is the way in which family policing criminalizes black children. And it does it in a number of ways, including the way in which children who experience foster care are at far higher risk of being placed in juvenile detention, getting harsher penalties when they're in the juvenile legal system, and eventually being incarcerated. Again, well documented that foster care puts children at risk of incarceration. And so that is one way in which I say it criminalizes black children, because foster care itself is structured to make children vulnerable to being placed in the juvenile and criminal legal systems. It also criminalizes black children in the way in which the settings that black teenagers are more likely to be placed in, what are called residential treatment facilities, which in many places are like prisons. And I just mention here to give some honor to two young black men, teenagers, boys really, who were killed in so-called residential treatment centers. Cornelius Fredericks in so-called Lakeside Academy in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and David Hess in Philadelphia's Wordsworth Academy, where for minor infractions, Cornelius Fredericks just threw a piece of bread in the cafeteria. They were assaulted by staff who really act like prison guards and killed. Recent cases, and these aren't the only ones, many of these places house both children who've been placed in juvenile detention and children who are in foster care, and they treat them all as if they were criminals in really highly restrictive conditions in cells without adequate education. Now, on top of all these harms I've just described, which are unnecessarily imposed on families who the vast majority would be better served by giving them the resources that they need to care for children. these systems take money from the children. As this Marshall Project report shows, in most states and Washington, D.C., state child welfare departments become the financial representatives of children in foster care and take their benefits. Whether we're talking about SSI benefits, survivor benefits, or disability benefits. And they're not taking them to spend on the children. They're just putting them in the coffers of the city or the state and spending it on whatever they want. These children are denied these benefits that they are entitled to by the federal government. Many of these children would have had thousands and thousands of dollars had they been able to keep it, and then they age out of foster care with nothing after the state has taken their money. Wisconsin is one of these where the Marshall Project discovered that hundreds of millions of dollars have been taken from children in foster care by claiming their SSI benefits. And they work with what are called revenue maximization companies, like Maximus, where the purpose of these companies is to increase the revenue of states and cities. And so the point of it is, which children can we get the most money from? If you read, I write about this in Torn Apart, based largely on the work of David Hatcher, who's a professor at University of Baltimore Law School, and he collected the emails between Maximus and different state agencies, and they talk about children as commodities. I heard an NPR story the other day where they said that I hope I'm saying this correctly, my recollection is the CEO of Maximus made $6 million last year, while they are working to extract money from the children they're supposed to be taken care of. They have no right to that money. They have an obligation to care for these children. And that's on top of some places then charging the parents for what it costs to keep their children away from them. Can you imagine you're fighting to keep your children, then you get a bill? I write in Torn Apart, it's like a kidnapper taking your child and then giving you a bill for the cost of maintaining your child. That's what it feels like. That's what it feels like. And again, with this, they're not spending it on the children. So it's not even as if they're being reimbursed. They have no right to be reimbursed. They're getting federal funding and other funding to maintain children in foster care. So they have no right to their money, but even if they were spending it on them, that's what they should be doing. They should be spending money on, but they don't need it. They get funding for it. So it's, in my opinion, just stealing money of children. Now, all of this, in addition to the way in which these systems operate together, I mean the policing system and the family policing system, there's also underlying it what I call a carceral logic. And that is the logic that the way in which we should meet the needs of the most disenfranchised, marginalized communities in America, marginalized by structural racism, marginalized by poverty, marginalized by denial of voting rights, marginalized by high rates of incarceration, marginalized in all these ways, the way to deal with that is to take their children away from them and maintain them outside the home or supervise them intensively. And that is a logic that diverts attention from the real root causes of unmet children's needs and the need for radically changing the way in which we deal with just the human needs of people in our society. So instead of recognizing those underlying causes, this system operates on a logic that says child maltreatment is a result of parents' pathologies, and the way to address it is to supervise them and cure them. What we need to cure is our society. We need to cure childhood poverty in America. That's what we need to cure. America has the highest rate of childhood poverty of any nation in the so-called Western world, any industrialized, so-called developed nation, but it takes away more children and terminates more parental rights than any nation in the Western or industrialized world. Something is wrong with that equation. Something is wrong with that. If we ended child poverty in America, and I'll just be blunt, if we took all that almost $40 billion that's spent on maintaining children away from their homes and just gave it to families to take care of their children, I am absolutely convinced, yes, as this brother said, problem solved. We would not need to be investigating, separating families, putting children in foster care. I am absolutely convinced of it. Okay, I'm going to go past that. So my conclusion is, when we see cases like the ones I started out with, it's not because something went wrong with the system. It's not an aberration. It's not a malfunction. That's how the system is designed to operate. If those families didn't protest, didn't get national news, those children may all still be in foster care now. And so we have to be honest about how this system operates, and can we imagine a better way? It's not about not caring for children. It's about how can we care for children without the harms to children that the system is inflicting on them. Can we imagine a better way? And you know, we should be able to imagine it because, as I mentioned, black people for most of U.S. history did not get involved in this formal system. We were denied entry into it. And yet, we were able to raise children under the most horrific circumstances. What'd you say?
And raise babies.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Okay, look, I'm just gonna, where's Jermaine? Can I just have like 3 more minutes? Okay, because I always end up skipping this, and the other day I didn't mention this. Someone came up to me and said, well, what about the Adoption Safe Families Act? So I'm just going to quickly go over this because I want to make the point that in the 1990s, we saw a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president in a bipartisan measure pass 3 laws that I want us to see as all connected. The first one was the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. This kind of came up during Biden's campaign because he had to backpedal a little bit because black people were saying, you supported that bill, and that's what increased mass incarceration in America. This was a law that gave more money to police, encouraged more intensive surveillance and arrests in black communities, and many people, including myself, believe that it was a bad law to pass, that it increased the policing and incarceration of black people in America. So that came first. Then shortly after that, just 2 years later, came the welfare restructuring law. This was the law that ended the federal entitlement to assistance for needy families. It ended any federal guarantee if you were a struggling family to get welfare benefits. So that then went to the states to decide, and all sorts of limitations to welfare, time restrictions, behavior modification rules. I mean, the Congress was clear. We're passing this law not to support families, but to encourage black mothers to get married, take low-wage work, and stop having so many children. This is very explicit about this. Now, another law that fewer people pay attention to was related to this, and that's the Adoption Safe Families Act, which was passed just 1 year after the welfare law. And that law looked at this burgeoning child welfare foster care population with, again, made up mostly by black children. And it said, why are black children languishing in foster care? And the answer wasn't because we're taking too many black children away. It wasn't because we're keeping them in foster care too long, we should return them to their families. It was because we're holding on to black mothers' rights too long. And we need to terminate their rights faster. And so the law sped up the termination of parental rights, again with black families and children at the forefront of this, explicitly mentioned in the lobbying for this law. And it sped up the termination. So if a child is in foster care for 15 of the last 22 months, the assumption is the state should go in and petition to terminate the parental rights. And there are many judges who began terminating parental rights faster because of the Adoption Safe Families Act. And then incentives to get these children adopted with no similar incentives to return them home. Financial incentives, what some people will say are bounties on children's heads. States get more money. They get a bounty. They get a bonus if they increase the adoptions of children. So think about this. This is the first time in U.S. history where states were required to protect children from child abuse and neglect, mainly by taking children away. That's where most of the money was spent, but without the requirement to support families. Just think about how punitive this is. Locking up more black people, terminating more black parental rights, and denying any guarantee to federal assistance. The answer is lock them up, take away their children, not to really question why it is that there are so many struggling families in America. Okay, so I'm going to conclude now. Thank you for that. I really like the words of Malcolm X to sum up what this system does. He says, I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. And I think that's exactly what we're doing. We have a society that has structures and systems that crush people, that don't allow them the opportunities to end poverty in their communities and in their families, and then blames them for it because they're unable to meet the needs of their children. I don't think we should have any compassion. I have no compassion for that. I have compassion for all the families that are fighting to get their children back. That's who I have compassion for. So, what do I mean by abolitionist organizing? It means we have to, step by step, think about ways that we can reduce the harm that this system inflicts on families. Giving families information about their rights. Why should only wealthy families be able to call a lawyer when a caseworker comes to their home? Why should only wealthy families have the money to have resources for their children? Everyone should have an equal right to their family. And how can we put that into law? And then at the same time, again, this isn't about leaving families to fend for themselves, leaving children unprotected, leaving children with unmet needs. So how can we keep children safe? How can we support families? How can we provide the material resources that families need? How can we do that? Can we build up those ways of doing it through policy, through real social services that aren't about reporting people but are about supporting people, through community-based networks that provide the care that families and children need? So I really hope that as we continue in this wonderful conference, this wonderful collection of people who are all, I know every one of you is interested in how to end injustice for families and how to have a safer, healthier, more caring world. I hope that you'll keep that in mind as we move forward and work together collectively to actually put in place a reimagined vision of truly caring for families and children and keeping them safe. So thanks so much for your attention. Have a wonderful rest of the conference. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful job, wonderful job, wonderful job. Thank you so much. Thank you.